It's a huge treat for me tonight to welcome Jackie Kay to the Life Writing Centre. Jackie's first given name was Joy, and she is a person who brings joy into the room. She's a hugely well-known public figure whose roles, past and present, include being the Scottish Poet Laureate, the Mooker, Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle, and Chancellor of the University of Salford. She works generously in Britain and across the world to bring poetry and writing to children and schools. She has a CBE for services to literature, and she's won many awards. In her writing, she is magnificently various and prolific. She's not only a poet, but also a novelist, a memoirist, a short story writer, and a writer for radio, stage, and television. Her voice leaps off the page in whatever form you read her: intimate, eloquent, angry, loving, tender, friendly, argumentative, and right inside your ear. She's an addictive storyteller, from her impassioned life of Bessie Smith and her vividly fictionalized version of the jazz musician Billy Tipton in Trumpet, to the extraordinary range of characters in her story collections. I love that one of these collections is called Why Don't You Stop Talking? But tonight we aren't ever going to want her to stop talking. One of the most remarkable stories she tells is the one in her memoir, Red Dust Road, of the discovery of her birth parents and their families in Nigeria and in Scotland, and of her relation with the mum and dad who brought her up, proud and lovable Scottish communists. All these characters, who are also everywhere in her poems, are where we're going to start tonight. Jackie's going to read to us a bit from the memoir, and then we'll have a talk. And she's also a bit later on going to give us the privilege of hearing 2 new poems. And after our conversation, there will be the chance for you all to ask questions, and then please to join us for drinks and book signing in the cafe next door. We learn in the memoir that in Nigeria, the Igbo way of welcoming people to their village is to beat the drums, which leads Jackie to ask herself in the book, how many people ever really get it, the welcome of the beating drum? So in welcoming Jackie Kay to our life writing village, please do your best to imitate the sound of beating drums. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction, Hermione. Really lovely. And nobody's done the beating of the drums, so hello everybody. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Back in Oxford. Last time I was in Oxford, I was in conversation with my dear friend Peggy Seeger, who I'm really delighted is here with us today. So I'm going to read a wee bit from the very opening of Red Dust Road before I sit down and we have a good wee chat. So I found my birth father surprisingly easily. I just put his name into Google and up popped Pop. And the reason that Pop popped so quickly is because he was a world tree specialist, a leading ethnobotanist. And so that seemed very, very bizarre to me right from the get-go, that there I was tracing my family tree and should find this tree specialist father. It was the kind of thing that if I had put in a novel, nobody would have believed me. It would have just been far, far too far-fetched. And then when I actually met him, it was even more far-fetched, and I realized that I was almost propelled into writing this book. So I stood at this hotel in Abuja where he'd agreed to meet me, waiting for him to come and looking at every black man that came along. It was a Sunday, everybody was all dressed up. It was like watching a fashion show of old black men walk the gangway towards me, and I was looking, thinking, which one's him? It took ages before he appeared. He was about 2.5 hours late, and then he did appear, and he was dressed all in white, a long white African dress, very ornately embroidered in lace, and white trousers. We walk along the corridor to the lift and all the lights suddenly go out. Another power cut. I take his hand and lead him towards the lift in the dark. I grope about in the darkness, holding my father's hand. Then the lights suddenly come back on again and we get in the lift. He doesn't talk. I know he won't talk until he gets into the room. He doesn't look at me. He looks down at his black shoes and clasps his hands. He's carrying a plastic bag, a white plastic bag. When I met my birth mother, she was also holding a plastic bag. Both my birth parents, on first sight, look like some homeless people look like, who carry important papers in carrier bags. I've been told they met in 1961 in the dance hall in Aberdeen. Jonathan was a student there, and my mother was a nurse. They kept in touch during my mother's pregnancy. Then Jonathan returned to Nigeria, and my mother went to a mother and baby home in Edinburgh to have me. I was adopted 5 months later by a couple in Glasgow, the people who are to me my real parents. They are lifelong committed socialists. When I traced my birth mother some years ago, I discovered that after her relationship with Jonathan, she'd become a Mormon, the Latter-day Church of Jesus Christ Saints or whatever. The Mormons, she told me, believe that adopted people cry out to be adopted while still in the womb. When I told my mum that my mother was a Mormon, she said, "Oh, Jesus, that's a pits. Why not have a wee half bottle and forget all about it?" And now we're in the room. I'm about to have a conversation with my birth father for the very first time. Jonathan is moving about from foot to foot, shifting his weight from side to side like a man who is about to say something life-changing. He begins, "Before we can proceed with this meeting, I would like to pray for you and to welcome you to Nigeria. I feel alarmed. Extreme religion scares the hell out of me. It seems to me like a kind of madness, but it's obvious that Jonathan won't be able to talk at all if I try and skip the sermon. So I say, okay then, and he says, sit, please. He plucks the Bible from the plastic bag. Then he immediately starts whirling and twirling around the blue hotel room, dancing and clapping his hands above his head, below his waist, popping his face up to the ceiling, then down to the floor, singing, "Oh God Almighty, oh God Almighty, oh God Almighty. We welcome Jackie Kay to Nigeria. Thank you, God Almighty, for bringing her here safely. She has crossed the waters. She has landed on African soil for the very first time. Oh God Almighty." He does some very fancy footwork. He's incredibly speedy for a man of 73. He's swirling like a dervish. Suddenly, he takes off his shoes and puts them on my bed and kneels on the floor and reads the first of many extracts from the Bible. He seems to half read and half recite them. He appears to know the Bible by heart. As he recites, he looks at me directly, an odd look, quite charming, slightly actorish. The sermon for him is a kind of performance. His whole body gets thrown into it. God has given you this talent. You're a writer. You have written books. You have been blessed. God already knows about you. Don't think for a second God has not been waiting for you. Now all you must do is receive Christ, and your talent will become even bigger. Amen. From this moment on, you're protected. God protects the talented. Amen. You can walk through fire. You won't get burnt. You can swim in dangerous waters. You won't drown. Don't even bother with your hotel safe. God is looking out for you. I shift uneasily in my seat. Christ Almighty, my father is barking mad. He spins and dances and sings some more, singing in the most god-awful flat voice, really off-key. The singing sounds like a mixture of African chanting and hymns. It's a shock. Despite the fact that he can't sing, his performance is captivating. I watch his bare feet dance around the room and recognize my own toes. I can see in your eyes that you're not yet able to put your full trust in God. And yet you know this would make me happy. Think of the people you could do you could meet. At every reading you do, you could take the message of our Lord. Think of the people you could convert. I think of the 12 people at a poetry reading in Milton Keynes Central Library on a rainy Thursday night. Think of the people you could bring to the Lord if you get ready to receive Christ. I try and look as non-committal as possible. I start to think I should try and get this to stop. It feels like a kind of assault. He senses me thinking this and says, just one more extract from the Bible. I prayed to God you would be patient, and you are being patient. I prayed to God you would be docile, and you are being docile. He wants me to be cleansed of his past sin. If animal blood can cleanse sins under the old law, how much more can the blood of Jesus Christ cleanse us and prepare us for glory? I realize with a fresh horror that Jonathan is seeing me as a sin, me as impure, me, the bastard, illegitimate. I'm sitting here, evidence of his sinful past, but I'm the sinner, the live embodiment of his sin. He's moved on now. He's a man of glory and of God, but I'm sitting here on this hotel room chair, little better than a whore in his eyes, dirty and unsaved, the living proof of sin. Christianity has taken away his African culture and given him this. I'm thinking about colonialism and missionaries and not properly listening. I hear his voice in the background. God knows how long it's all been going on for now. I've zoned out. I go in and out of consciousness like somebody who's very ill. I can't see properly. Pages of the Bible are flying around the room like hummingbirds. I'm desperate for a drink. My glass of wine is sitting in the front of the table in front of me, but it seems disrespectful to drink alcohol in the middle of my own personal service. Thank you for your patience, Jonathan says again. After another half an hour faces up to eternity, the tears are pouring down my face. I can't stop. It's a flood. It's self-pity. Jonathan is delighted to see them. He thinks I'm moved by his sermon. I am moved. My cheeks are soaking wet. I wipe them with my bare hands as Jonathan's voice goes deep and he lifts his hands in the air and he claps and spins like a windmill. I think, maybe it's nearly over. Dear God, I'll believe in you. If only this will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. It is hilarious, but it's also painful. And my sort of first big question to you really about Red Dust Road is how you balance the pain and the comedy, the sadness and the rejoicing. There's a moment in the middle of the book where you talk about the pain of the adopted child. You say a child who has been adopted was still a child who could feel terribly hurt. And thinking about Wuthering Heights, actually, you say, there is still a windy place right at the core of my heart. So I want to ask you about that balance. This begins with this completely hilarious scene, but it's also, this is the father that you have come to find.
Yeah, it's interesting you should ask that. It didn't feel like it was funny at the time because it did go on for 2.5 hours, and it was quite intense. And it only got to be more light really when we went out to the hotel room bar. But even then, that was a kind of strange conversation because he said to me, "You said in your letter that you didn't want to answer to a man. This is a strange thing to say. So if you're not married and you do not have a boyfriend or such, how do you cater for your sex drive?" And so I thought that was a really unfatherly question. And I remember coming back to Glasgow and telling my mum about the whole thing and telling her the entire story. And I had, I've got a recall of conversations, which is a lucky kind of thing. But And my mum was just actually laughing so much. The tears were pouring down her face. And at one point, she kind of kicked her legs up in the air and was kicking her legs back and forth. And it was only then that I actually realised that it was funny in the retelling of it.
Yes.
But at the time, it gave me a kind of migraine, and I lay down for 2.5 hours. For as long as he prayed for me, I lay down in the dark and just kind of closed things off.
But the whole experience that the book talks about and describes of, your desire to find your birth parents, and the very kind of difficult and complicated way in which that turns out to be as experiences with your birth mother as well as with Jonathan. It must have been profoundly disappointing in a way, or it must have been something you really wanted to feel an affinity and then you didn't, or am I sentimentalizing it?
No, I think it was disappointing because I did grow up with a very imaginative adoptive mother who did like to try and imagine my brother and mine birth parents. She liked to kind of include them in. Like on her birthday, she'd say, somewhere there's a woman out there thinking of you, Jackie. And she'd like to try and picture. And with my birth father, she'd say, she knew he came from Nigeria. That's all we kind of knew. And she knew he was into agriculture. In fact, he studied here at Oxford, so it's funny to be here. He did his MA at Oxford University. But she'd say about my birth father, I'm picturing a Paul Robeson type, Jackie. Maybe with a bit of Nelson Mandela mixed in. So I kind of had this fantasy father and this composite image, and it was really kind of exciting to me. And I had him quite tall and, all the rest. So nobody really pictures the small, do they? We don't get a look in when people are imagining people. They don't picture the wee person. But anyway, so yes, he was very different. He was different in every respect to how I'd imagined him. But he was very charismatic. And he was a really interesting preacher, and he had, it was hard not to be disappointed.
And with your mother too, with your birth mother, similarly, a feeling of that it was more difficult or more troubling than you would have liked it to be, or
I think it's you go on a roller coaster ride when you're adopted, which is why apparently only 10% of adopted people actually trace. The other 90% leave well alone, and you kind of can understand why people don't want to trace, because you're suddenly, obviously people that have had to give you up for adoption have been vulnerable, fragile in their own ways for whatever different reasons, so you're already going to be going into a situation that maybe involves secrets, that involves a ticking time bomb, that involves a family that maybe don't know. You've already got all of these all of these ingredients that you see in these reality TV formats, only they always show you people meeting and being kind of happy ever after. And I think that was one of the reasons that I wrote Red Dust Road, because I felt dissatisfied with that kind of format, that it tells this one side of a story that for so many people it's just really not like that. It's actually, if anything, you feel a kind of grief for the imaginary birth parents that you had when you meet the real ones.
Like the dream children that you don't have. Life writing of this kind, of this very personal kind, as you've already been saying, involves not just you, not just writing about yourself, but also about other people. And this book is full of other people, your birth father and mother and their families who gradually become part of the story, your own parents who adopted you, the brother you grew up with and the other brother that you discover towards the end, and very importantly for you, your friends and your fellow writers who are very important parts of the book. So how does it feel to write about these others? Did you need permission? And did you have any problems?
Well, I think you'll know this yourself from all your wonderful writing about people, that you do feel a great responsibility when you're writing about people, actually whether they're living or dead. You feel some responsibility to get things right. And because this was my first time with this particular forum, I found it really nerve-wracking and frightening. I worried a lot about how people would take it. I did let my mum and dad and my brother read it before, whilst it was still in proof. Funnily enough, I got because I got all their notes on one of the manuscripts that's now in the National Library of Scotland, so you can go over. It's quite funny. But my brother said, "Sister,
page 150. Well, first of all, he said, well, I found the book interesting, but I'm in this family. I doubt anyone else in the world is going to find this book interesting. So I'm sorry, sisters, but you've written a dud. So that's what he thought. But he had certain little corrections to make. So he said, sisters, page 154, you've got me riding a Honda 750 XL. It was a Yamaha 500.
That is so fun. That is always the way.
It's always the way. It's always in the tiny details.
Yeah. Penelope Fitzgerald, when she, just in brackets, when she wrote a very true-to-life book about the BBC during the war, and there were lots of very recognisable people in it, and she said, I got all these letters from people saying, and I was expecting them to say, you totally misconstrued my life and you misrepresented me, and they would say, you said I had a red pencil, and I had a blue pencil.
I know, people are extraordinary. I know. And there's a bit in it that I wrote that my Glaswegian dad, was jealous when I went to Nigeria to meet my birth father. And so he got to this bit in the proof and he said to me, how would I be jealous when I wasn't jealous when you found your birth mother? And she was in this country and he's all the way in Nigeria. And my mum said, because it was another father, John. And my dad said to me, well, can you put in your book, my dad disputes this? So I had to kind of find a way. I said, well, I can only really write that sentence if I write it in the conditional. Yes. Otherwise, it'll jolt the reader out of wherever they are. So if I write, although if I were to say this to my dad, I'm sure he would dispute this. And he went, aye, that'll do. So it was quite, and I was quite glad I was able to put things like that.
Did you ever feel you were betraying anyone?
Yeah, you do feel you're betraying. But on the other hand, I felt like, I remember being in this parlour in Nigeria, having my nails done and saying that I was going to go and find my birth father's village. This is the second trip when he didn't agree to meet, and saying that I didn't know if he would, and he'd kept me secret from his family. And by this time I was 49, and she laughed, almost hysterically. She went, but you're fully grown. You're fully grown. You're fully grown. How could you be a secret when you're fully grown? And that was a really interesting concept to me, because of course people can be still secrets. I actually went to my birth mother's funeral and I was still a secret, and they introduced me as the Macker, the national poet of Scotland, but they didn't tell anybody that I was her daughter.
Incredible.
And that was very strange. And I thought, what would the Macker be doing at a Mormon funeral in Milton Keynes? So
and you do expose all these secrets. You talk about secrets and you expose them. Yeah. So in a way, you are you have, in a sense, opened up all these people's lives onto these pages.
And not everybody's going to like it, and not everyone's going to agree. The aunties in the Highlands, even though I thought that the chapter on them is very generous and warm and friendly, they don't like, no. And one of them came up to me at my birth mother's funeral and she said, shall I tell you why I'm angry with you? And I said, yes, please do. And she said, because none of us should have even known you were born. And it was just such a shocking thing. Just
shocking.
At the funeral, it was such a shocking.
Very shocking.
And people do, it's quite hard to remember the kind of shame that there was around illegitimacy, so-called illegitimacy in the early 60s, late 50s. There's a kind of whole different society, but it's still, even for only like a few years ago, 2016, I'm talking about, that she said that to me. That seemed a very bizarre thing to still be saying in 2016, and it made me feel quite disturbed by it. I remember going back again to Glasgow and telling my parents, and my dad was really angry, and he said the Magdalene Sisters Coven because they were all kind of Catholics from the north of Scotland, and he just thought of them as a whole coven up there, and had to and he just didn't want to have anything really to do with them. And that's, I think, the most disturbing thing, is that for people that are the adoptive parents, when their children trace, it throws them into turmoil.
Yes.
And that's the thing, I think, is very difficult about writing a book too.
So the other difficulty about writing this kind of book, not that I've read anything quite like this actually ever, is that you have the you have your childhood, you have the discovery, you have the return visits, and the book has a kind of wonderful rocking motion in terms of its structure, so that it moves between past and present, childhood and writing, almost as though you're catching up with yourself in the process of writing. So was that a given? Did that come naturally, or did it take a lot of working out to get that structure?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it took a lot of working out. Basically, I wrote the whole book chronologically, and I remember showing it to my then partner, Carol Ann Duffy, who said that the book was full of self-pity, and that I'm not a self-pitying person, and she said that the tone didn't suit me. And so that kind of horrified me, and so I just threw that out and started all over again. And I realised that in order to kind of get rid of, because memoirs all tone, tense and time, really, and I realised that in order to get rid of some of that tone, that I'd have to tell the story non-chronologically, but have enough of an engine in it for people to still feel like they were being propelled forwards. So I ended up kind of drawing the whole book out in a huge map, which is also in the National Library now, but it's really funny because, you know, if in doubt, just get some stationery. When you're writing, some stationery and some thick pens, and like have fun drawing arrows and things going here and things going there. And it was just quite a massive, complicated structure that I quite liked.
That's so
doing
interesting
that.
to me, the way it evolved.
And the little bits that you were talking about that go into childhood, I decided that the reader needed some sort of time narrative. So those little 500-word bits kind of give the reader some sort of ladder, so as they know where they are. But yeah.
Moving out from the central theme of adoption and discovery, it is also very much, as quite a few of your stories are, about belonging and not belonging, about the question of where do you belong. I mean, you write about the not belonging entailed in being black in Scotland, in being gay, in being adopted, and you have phrases like, part of me was foreign to myself, or being black in a white country makes you a stranger to yourself as you were growing up. And then, before we talk about this, I wonder if you could read a very short poem, which you say you already know, which is called Somebody Else, from the collection Darling, because it puts this in the focus.
Yeah. If I was not myself, I would be somebody else. But actually, I am somebody else. I have been somebody else all my life. It's no laughing matter going about the place all the time, being somebody else. People mistake you. You mistake yourself.
Wonderful, thank you. So is that the driving force of the writing, the sense of, as it were, being somebody else?
Yeah, I think that perhaps all writers have a sense of being somebody else, almost whatever you're writing, whether you're writing poetry, whether you're writing biography, whether you're writing literary criticism, whether you're writing novels, you have this other self that is the writer self, that is kind of, you know, in your own life, that still eats and goes to the toilet and whatever, and still does the things, but there's a kind of a slight separation, I think. And I think when you're adopted, you have another self too. You have this other life that you so could have easily have led if you'd been adopted by different parents. I mean, I could have had a different life if I'd been adopted by Tories, for instance, you know, or if I'd been brought up in an orphanage, or, you know, whatever. So it's almost like just to the other side of you, there's this other life that you could have had. But for a writer, I think that's very fertile ground, the possibility, all the different possibilities of all the different lives, and they start to kind of accumulate in you. And sometimes they can, the absence of the thing that hasn't happened can become an actual presence. And so I'm quite interested in my work in that, with identity and in belonging and not belonging, and in absence. I mean, people when they're grieving or when they've lost somebody in any way, but particularly in a traumatic way, often that absence becomes an actual presence for them, and they have to learn how to live their life with absence. They have to almost incorporate absence into their life as part of their way of dealing with something. And I think that's really one of the things that I write about a lot, about love and the loss of it.
Indeed, yes. I want to come back to that whole question of having more than one life or other lives, but I also want to ask you about, in respect of Red Dust Road, since you are a fiction writer and a poet, I want to know how much you made up. Your dad says to you at one point in the book, "You bloody writers, you make so much up." And of course, it's a very cunning thing to have dropped that into the narrative, because you're writing a lot about the relationship between imagination and reality. And you were talking earlier about your mum saying, "Oh, maybe your birth father is like a cross between Paul Robeson and Nelson Mandela," and he turns out not to be. And when you're a child, you're making up the idea of Nigeria in your head, and you say the less you are given, the more you can make up. And you also say about the process of adoption, everyone involved in adoption has an imaginary version of everyone else. So what's the relationship in the book between stuff you've made up and stuff that actually happened? And you say you have a vivid recollection for dialogue, but when you're reading, you think, my God, she remembers every word of a conversation. Can she have made some of that up?
No, I mean, I do. I think with conversations, it's pretty accurate, because I remember intonations and phrases and things that people say. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, because I think that when you write a memoir, it's almost like you don't need it to be true, to use a Glaswegian expression, but you need it to be imaginatively true. And for something to be imaginatively true, it has to also be really true. So it's a very strange thing. So you can go around in circles with the whole thing. It's a kind of a conundrum, I think, like a puzzle,
yes.
A puzzle that you're constantly trying to solve. Because in order to bring somebody to the page bursting with life, they have to be imbued with enough life, but they also have to be imbued with enough of your own imagination to make them imaginatively live on the page, or else they'll be dead. They'll be dead on the page.
As an example, but just as an example of that, so there's some very touching scenes in which your birth mother is beginning to lose her memory, and you visit her, and she has, and this is a subject of yours that you quite often write about in old age and so on, and she has little post-it notes everywhere to, lock the door when you go out, that kind of thing. And one of the notes that you find says, "Don't forget Jackie," which is incredibly touching in the context. And obviously she's reminding herself that you're coming that day. And it's absolutely true to life. And then I thought to myself, I wonder if Jackie's made all that up.
That's really shocking to me that you'd think that. Oh my goodness.
No, because it's like, it's a brilliant scene in a novel.
No, it's absolutely true. No, I couldn't have made things like that up, because that would seem like an infringement, somehow almost immoral. No, the things, all the details like that are completely true. And I did come across it, "Don't forget Jackie." The weird thing was that she'd put it into my purse, and I get home and I open it. So she'd put it in my bag, in that way that people, I don't know how many of you have people that have dementia or Alzheimer's, but they're often hiding things or putting things in bags, and often very complicated handbags where different things are coming out. And so she'd put this little note, and when I got home, there was this little note saying, "Don't forget Jackie." So it really kind of floored me. I found it kind of immeasurably moving. Just that, yes, it was like a note to herself, but it was also a note ended up being a note to me, and ended up being a note in the book. And I suppose when I wrote that as a scene, I was fully aware of the potency of it. And maybe that's what you're asking about, in a sense.
Has a tremendous charge, and you almost feel this is a kind of cynical thing to say. Almost you feel, gosh, this was a piece of luck for the writer. You know, not a piece of luck for the person, but you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah. It's dodgy territory, really.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. I think that the strange thing is, when you're with somebody who has dementia, she forgot her daughter. I was going to say her actual daughters, but in a sense they were her actual daughters, the ones that she'd brought up. But she did remember me, so she remembered me after she'd forgotten, and that made me think that there might be a relationship between Alzheimer's and secrecy, because she held on to this secret. And I remember one time walking with her in this kind of quite beautiful park. Milton Keynes is full of beautiful parks, and and my half-sister was walking in front, and she said to me, "Who's that lady?" And I said, "Well, that's your daughter." So that's the kind of thing that's not in the book, because the book doesn't go on that long. But yeah.
And this links up to this question of a sort of forgetting in old age, forgetting oneself, goes along with something you were talking about earlier, which is can you have more than one life, or living an imaginary life? In Red Dust Road, the sentence comes, "You can't have two lives, just one." And in the stories, this recurs. There's a character in one of the stories who says, the strange thing about life was that you could only live the one of them. You couldn't live the other one. But actually, in the stories, a lot of your characters do have two lives. They have the life of their imagination, which they sort of escape into, sometimes quite dangerously for them and for other people. And then they have, and it's almost as it were a kind of consolation for reality, which is the title of one of your books, for the life they have to have. So can you talk a bit about that preoccupation with the idea of maybe it is possible to have more than one life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fascinating question. I think that when you're imaginative, you're already having an extra life. And when you create, you're already having an extra life. You might actually be creating lives. You're giving birth to these different characters and to these ideas and to these notions, and perhaps trying to introduce your readers to different ideas and notions. And that's quite a liberation as well. You know, it's a bit like falling in love. When people fall in love for the first time, they suddenly feel as if they've been granted another life. And if they fall in love later again in life, they feel like they've been granted a completely different life. And then when they fall out of love, what can you say? It's again another life. And I think writing's kind of akin to that our lives have several different stages, might span several different countries, might take place in different parts, in different kind of physical shape, you know, different physical shape, but our imaginative life is still very rich. And I remember, watching my parents be in hospital and being very frustrated that they'd left this extraordinary life, being peace protesters, being put in prison in Dunoon for being protesting against Polaris in 1961. So many peace protesters that they locked, some of them up in the Catholic Church in Dunoon, and the rest in the jail. So yeah, my dad was in the jail, my mum was in the Catholic Church, and then but you'd be in hospital and you'd just be treated like an old person that had no life, had no interest, had no, and that to me was kind of endlessly frustrating. So I'm quite interested in that, in what chance our lives give us to kind of renew themselves, to open themselves out for another life to come along, and for us to inhabit a bit of a different version of ourselves. And when people get very depressed, it's often because that possibility feels as if it's gone to them, and there's a terrible repetition of days, a terrible repetition of everything. You know, it's almost like the imaginative escape that gives people the jolt to do something, to be something.
Your story about your parents in hospital just reminds me of my very elderly father, who'd been a doctor all his life. And the first thing that they did when he was in the hospital was to take the word doctor, take the title off. So he was just another old man. You know, they didn't want to be looking after a doctor. You know, God forbid.
Shocking.
Not otherwise they were very good to him, I may say. But some of these imaginary lives that your fictional characters have, are pretty extreme. Some of them are pretty kind of crazy or obsessed or extreme. I mean, the man who's kind of killed by his imaginary fear of sharks, or the woman who can't stop talking, or the woman who steals a baby, or the person who makes a whole elaborate ceremony out of having Christmas alone. You know, there are a lot of characters like this, and one becomes very involved with them. So why are you drawn to such people in your stories? Not in your real memoir, but in your fiction?
I think the short story form deals very well with people that don't fit in, with people that feel on the outside of things, and with people that feel a kind of extreme loneliness, with people that are obsessive, with people that are on the edge of things. And so I really enjoy creating these characters, and they often just come to me, like there's one called The Woman with Fork and Knife The Woman with Fork and Knife Disorder, and that character just came to me as I was trying to put my the forks and knife, and one jumped out and went in the wrong place, and I went, and then that gave me the whole idea for this character. That was,
knives and forks just keep coming at you, and they're all disarranged.
And it's almost like a horror story, but it came from just quite an innocent.
I thought it was a poltergeist story, actually, but then I realised no, it's not quite that. Yeah.
And then there's a woman who gives birth to a fox called My Daughter the Fox. And I found that if you kind of imbue a story with enough reality, your reader will take the imaginative leap and believe you. But I remember one time going to St Andrews to get an honorary doctorate, and I was in the car with my mum, dad, and my brother, and that story came on the radio. It's really bizarre. It was somebody else, an actor, reading it. My brother he liked listening to the radio, and he listened to it, and he went, the end of it. Only you would have been nuts enough to write a story. It was really hilarious.
I like your brother.
It was he was a real character.
So quite often these people, these misfits, these people who are on the edge, are subjected to cruelty. They are not understood, and they are bullied, and they are ostracized, and people look horrifiedly at them. And quite a lot of your writing, politically and personally, is about the ugliness of bigotry, of racism, of the violence and injury that people can inflict on other people. And you have some strong examples of it in your own life, growing up in Scotland, particularly at school sometimes. This is a big question and takes us out of the life writing zone, as it were. But how do you see now what's happening in Britain in those terms, and how do you feel you can write about it?
Well, in Redhurst Road, there is a whole chapter called Reality Britain, because there's another chapter called Fantasy Africa, and I like, V.S. Naipaul said all landscapes exist in the imagination. I liked creating Fantasy Africa in Redhurst Road, but I didn't like recreating Reality Britain, which included these fascist attacks, because twice in my life I've been attacked by fascists, quite brutally. One time at university where the fascists put up these posters with my name on them, and behind the posters they put razor blades, so as if anybody was going to try and rip the posters down, they would get their hands slashed. And they said the Women's Collective, because I was in this feminist group at university, age sort of 17, the Women's Collective is an ugly bunch of degenerate bastards. For instance, would you be seen with that Irish Catholic wog called Jackie Kay? And so then I was offered police protection at this time, and I didn't take it because I didn't trust the police. But it was a very harrowing experience, and since then, we've watched this country go through all of these different changes, and we're now in the year 2027. And I remember, we went out on anti-apartheid marches, and more recently we went out on Black Lives Matter marches. Still, my son went out on Black Lives Matter marches and got injured by the police quite badly. I couldn't walk. In fact, there's a poem for him and his friends in May Day about that. And it's really hard to hang on to hope when you live in a society where racism is kept being whipped up by people for all the wrong reasons, for importune reasons and immoral reasons, and where people are feeling like their belonging is tentative, even if they've belonged in a country for years. And there's all sorts of kind of really vile racism around now, people shouting things out of windows and all things that remind me of going straight back to the 70s. And so that kind of thing is really hard. I was talking to Angela Davis, who is kind of an American civil rights wonderful woman now in her 80s, and she says she still has hope. And so I think, well, if Angela Davis can still have hope, I can still have hope. But on some days you get up and you look at the news and you really have to G yourself up, and you have to think, you have to remember that history and time works in cycles, and that things come around, and that if you sit long enough in something, things will swing, because pendulums swing and momentum swing and things swing back. And that's what you have to. You have to then carry out what you believe in the ways that you can. And so the way that I can is to write. And
so let us gee ourselves up by hearing a bit more of your writing. Could you read a couple of the new poems? Thank you. Thanks so much.
I'll just take some more water. Would you like some water?
No, I'm fine.
I always find it's quite theatrical pouring water in front of an audience. I could turn myself into an Edinburgh Finn's performance show, spill it everywhere.
Don't spill it.
I'm going to go up here as well to give yourself a bit of variety, moving about the place. So this poem I've only read once before, and it's not yet published, and it's called "Call Her Joy," which Hermione was telling you was my name on my original birth certificate. And I wrote this in response to Joni Mitchell's song "Little Green." How many people here know Little Green? Quite a lot, yeah. Well, you'll know that she wrote Little Green for the daughter that she gave up for adoption. I always find that an awkward phrasing, gave up for. I wish there was a different one, but anyway, we'll roll with it for now. Call her joy. And there's some lines directly in this or directly in the song. If you're a little green junkie, you will recognise them. Born with the moon in Scorpio, sometimes there was sorrow. Call her joy, my father said to the social worker. When I met him in Abuja, he was born again. It was me who gave you your name, he said. And did you ever think of me? I asked my father. Not for a single second of a single day. Let her bring joy to the mother, to the father who'll have her. That's what I was thinking, he said. So joy I was first in Elsie Ingall's maternity, till a nurse took a shine to me and called me Julia. So Julia I was, Edinburgh, winter of 61. Then Mum came from Glasgow and called me Jacqueline. A pretty name, Jacqueline, she said. Jacqueline Kennedy, Jacqueline Dupre. Jacqueline Margaret Kay then, through till 10. Then Jackie, then Jack. There were crocuses and birthday clothes, and sometimes there was sorrow. But then there was you, Joni Mitchell, Joan Anderson. There was singing along with a hairbrush microphone in the back bedroom. Old Beale Street is coming down. I'm your lighthouse keeper through the years. No regrets, Coyote, just such different sets of circumstance. Imagine I traced my birth mother to you, and not my Mormon mother in Milton Keynes. Hijera through Bishop Briggs High School, you in blue, all through the year in Berkeley, night ride home when we flitted to Manchester, Court and Spark when I moved in here. 16 to 64, a lifetime of Joni, more than company, family down the lines. And every birthday my mum would say, somewhere in this big old world of ours, a woman is thinking of you. She's out there, she'd say, your mother. Not long ago, when I told my mum that my mother had died, she cried. When the district nurse came to inject her with insulin, she said, "What's the matter with you today, Helen?" My daughter's mother's died, she said. My daughter's mother's died. I never met her, but I always felt guilty that my happiness was another woman's sorrow. Sometimes there'll be sorrow. Call her joy. Leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I live in Manchester, and there's a sweet chestnut tree in Salford that's 300 years old. And this artist asked me to pick a year and to write something about that year and the tree. So this is sweet chestnut, and this hasn't been read. out loud to anybody. So look, the wee poem's fluttering with excitement. I'll have to tell it to calm down. Sweet Chestnut, 1862. A century before I was born, sweet chestnut, the tree was me, and I was the tree, famous for our mahogany seeds. My family gathered under the tree's benevolence, though they were not yet relations, the Kays, and moved to other cities, to Glasgow, to Dundee. Before they knew me, a century before I was born, they were my family tree, not blood, not bone, not DNA, but of the beech family. Their roots took hold of me, that mysterious ancestry, alchemy. Without the goodness of the tree, I am nobody.
How exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've just got a couple more questions arising out of those, and then I'm sure there are people here who want to ask you questions. So in a way, it struck me those two poems are both about inheritance of a kind, but not necessarily family inheritance that comes through songs and singers, inheritance that comes through the tree, through nature. And in your books, right across the different kinds of books that you write, you often talk about stories as a form of inheritance and about the influence of other writers, especially black writers actually, but not only black writers, who've changed your life, and how you've forged yourself to a degree through inheritances and friendships and connections which might be literary or musical rather than familial. So could you talk a bit about the importance to you of these sorts of legacies and inheritances and connections?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely question, Hermione. Thank you for spending all this time with me.
Oh, it's good.
We could spend more time. You're not fed up with me already. But you know, it's interesting to have somebody who's just read across the work and then makes these connections. Because often when people talk to you, they focus on one thing. They'll focus on your poetry, or they focus on your stories or your memoir, but they don't generally tend to focus on all of them. So that's very nice for me.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, we're kind of made up, all of us, through the things that we love, through the people that we love, the friends that we love, the books that we love, the music that we love. You know, if you were to take all of those outside, you know, if you think of us as a kind of cauldron, if you were to take those songs, books, friends, countries, places out of our cauldron, we would be quite different people. And so I'm really interested in, we focus so much on society, on DNA and on inherited traits, but I'm really interested in non-inherited traits and in the kind of things that make us actually who we are. You know, the poetry that we love, that we grew up with, the poetry that we come to love. You know, I see myself as being as loving Burns, because I went to Burns suppers from when I was a kid, and I first learned that Burns could be dramatic, and that when you got fair fire on his sonsy face, great chieftain o' the pudding race, aboon them all, you take your place, and the knife would get stabbed into the haggis, and the haggis would burst open, and it'd all be
that here.
Yeah, big thing. Yeah, and it'd all be kind of wonderfully dramatic, and so I really loved that, finding the drama in different poetry. But I loved also, you know, reading into poems and reading poems at school. I loved Ode to a Grecian Noun. I loved Keats. I really loved Yeats. I loved Audre Lorde. I loved having I loved Pablo Neruda. I really loved having a kind of I'm just talking about poets for now, since otherwise we could be here. I could really speak about the people that I loved. And sometimes you love people before you even get to meet them. So I loved Audre Lorde before I got to meet her. I loved Peggy Seeger before I got to meet her. I used to sing Peggy Seeger at Stirling University, and then our lives crossed, and I met her. And so that's a kind of an extraordinary thing. And I remember when I met Audre Lorde, you know, I was suddenly in her garden in
in Staten Island, near New York, and she pulls this black fig off a tree. I hadn't ever seen one before, I was like 22 or something. And she said, "You haven't seen a black fig? Jackie, you haven't lived." and then she fed me this black fig, and it felt like it was kind of like the whole thing. I feel I still must write a poem about that, because it wasn't an actual thing.
Called The Black
It was
Fig,
a black fig for Audrey Lawrence, but it actually was kind of oddly kind of erotic, because there was she feeding me this, told me to close my eyes, and I stood there with this black fig in my mouth. And then she was the one, Audrey Lawrence, that said to me, "Jackie, you can be black and Scottish. You don't have to choose." And that was really great, that she kind of made me feel that our identities are really multiple.
She told you could have two lives.
You could have two lives, you could be both, and you didn't have to choose. Yes. You didn't have to just say that you were one thing or the other. And I think, our identities are multiple. We're often told to choose, and people often feel pulled by the choices they have to make, even in families. Families are a strange little unit, really, that often gets people to make choices that nobody wants to make. And so that's a fascinating thing. There's folk gone for dinner now. Yeah, sorry.
So you were just talking about getting to know Peggy Seeger, having known her work. Before we open this to the audience, is there a poem you might like to read about?
Oh yes, Peggy? Yes I would actually. Yes, I could do that now.
Okay,
yes,
great.
So I had an interesting experience a few years back when Peggy went to my mum and dad's house in Glasgow. I couldn't be there myself, and I said, "It's a shame I can't be there. I'd have brought them." And she said, "Well, I can get them comps." And I said, "Well, they won't make it out on their own without me bringing it and a wheelchair in the car and all the rest of it." And she said, "Well, I'll come to them." So she went to them, and they sang peace songs and ate scones and jam. And that district nurse, the same one that was in the earlier poem, she came and injected my mum with insulin. And Carol was a huge Peggy Seeger fan. She said it was the best working day of her life. So I thought to thank Peggy for that, I should write this poem. And the poem did actually come to me a couple of years after that happened. Last night I dreamt of Peggy Seeger. She was singing a peace song to my mum, even though she knew that my mum had gone, as if she believed the dead still believe in peace after they have gone. She was singing to the stars and the trees, singing to the very air we breathe. She was singing to the robins, blackbirds, bees, to the grasses in the summer breeze, singing to the hope we could all be agreed, like all the peace songs that had gone before, that this old world would put an end to war. Last night I dreamt of Peggy Seeger.
Thank you so much. Questions? Can we change the lights a bit, maybe? Yes, wait for the mic. There's a lady there. Yeah. If it's possible to bring up the house lights and get rid of the glare, thank you so much, Alice. That's great.
You've got a great wee run going on there.
Jackie, I'd like to ask you about your mother, your adopted mother. I started to write my memoir, and I wasn't going to publish it, and then my publisher was interested in me doing it, and I had to ask myself hard questions, and I thought, actually, I've got to do it, because white women like me, who married men who weren't white, at a time of terrible hostility, when quite often on the street you would feel and sense disgust. Now, obviously, when you were with your adopted mother, nobody on the street would know that she wasn't your real mother. I wondered whether she experienced a lot of prejudice, as I did, but she obviously gave you huge self-belief, a wonderful sense of humour, and she must have been so, so proud of you. So I'm just wondering whether you could tell me a little bit more about her and whether she experienced that, whether she protected you, and how she's helped to make you the wonderful person you are.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thanks for telling us about yourself as well. She did. I mean, I really do feel that if there's a single person in my life that I owe a huge lot to, it is my mum that brought me up, who's to me my real mum, because she was the one that was there through everything. And she, when there were kind of racist things happen at school, or when people would beat you up, some kids were actually expelled from my primary school for beating me up on a regular basis. My mum and dad would just both go down to the school, but she would often say to me, "Do not give them your tears, Jackie, and I'll get angry with you." And that was quite good. It was quite tough, It was kind of tough love, because she was saying to me, "These people don't deserve your tears. Don't give them to them." So she often had a very different take on things, and she would, she was, very, very strongly anti-racist. It was in her very being. And my dad was too, and she had lots of incidents where if she was with me on her own, different things happened to her too, because people did think that she'd had a relationship with a black man, and she was treated in a different way. But nobody's ever asked me that, so that's a fascinating question. But I do remember a time on a bus once, and there was a black man on the bus, and the black man on the bus in Glasgow in the 60s was quite unusual in our part of Glasgow, and he was being very, very friendly to my mum. And my mum said to me afterwards, I was really young, but I do remember that. She said to me afterwards, "Did you see that man being so friendly to me? I think he thought that I had had a relationship with a black man, your father. Good on him," she said. "I wouldn't have minded," she said. So she was always like, every single thing would just kind of like form in your head as these other possibilities, because she was so quite imaginatively rich.
Other questions? Yes, Peggy wants it. Peggy, hang on for the mic, otherwise no one else will hear you. Thank you.
Just while you're on this subject, Jackie, would you tell the audience how you were adopted by one sentence from your mother?
Oh yes, I was adopted because my mum said when they went to the Scottish Adoption Agency, they were told they had no babies at all. And my mum said, just as a throwaway comment, "By the way, we don't mind what colour the child is." And because of that, they adopted my brother. And then because they got him, they decided they would have another baby, his colour, to keep him company, which was kind of forward thinking for the 60s. And so then 2 years later, my mum got a phone call from the Scottish Adoption Agency, and the woman said, "We've got a woman coming down from the Highlands, and the father of that baby's from Nigeria." And my mum said, without hesitation, I said, "I'll have that baby." And so she didn't know if I'd be a boy or a girl or whatever. It was the closest she could get to giving birth herself, she always said.
And you weren't well when you were born?
No, so when I was born with this big gash down my face and a forceps injury, and they thought it had gone to my brain. And so they wouldn't let my mum adopt me, so she was 5 months before she managed to get me home, and I was 5 months inside the hospital. But she did come through back and forth from Glasgow to Edinburgh, and she was the only one that was allowed to see me, and she'd have to wear a mask. But she couldn't believe it. And actually towards the end of her life, she kept returning to that they'd asked her to come and pick another baby because of this scar down my face, which poses as a cheekbone some of the time. But she'd say, "Fancy that, Jackie. They thought I would pick another baby. If I'd given birth to you, would I be saying I'm not having my baby because she's got a scar?" And she just felt like the whole way that people saw people that adopt as being really unjust and really unfair, that you'd say things to somebody that was an adoptive mum that you would never dream of saying to a biological mum. And it used to really offend her. But towards the end of her life, she went over and over that story. That was a story that she just kept on returning to, because our whole lives kind of held in the balance of these two throwaway remarks.
More questions? Yes, here.
Oops, better
And then
speed up there.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, a connection. I first heard of you working in Cruddas Park, which you may know in the West End of Newcastle, in social work. I was working with adoption. And you were a youngish poet. And mixed race. Yeah, well, even younger. And
question.
what I was just going to comment about was going back to, again, your adoptive mum. We did some very imaginative work, I think, looking back on it. And we ran a conference once on the adoption triangle in Gateshead. And we had invited adopted adults, adoptive mothers, and birth mothers. And you can imagine, we had lots and lots of people, much more than this. It was quite dangerous at times, and there was lots of impassioned feelings. But I have never forgotten being with the group of adoptive mothers, with an adoptive mother who must have been well into her 50s by this time. Her adopted daughter had fled. And she said, there was never a day of my life when I got this gorgeous baby home from the hospital when I didn't have the birth mother sitting on my shoulder saying, I'm watching you now, I'm watching you now. Yeah. Make sure you feed her well. Make sure you are kind and whatever. And she had been very, very full of guilt. You mentioned that your adoptive mother obviously didn't feel depressed or anything, but I think it's a very important thing to acknowrithe.
Interesting comment. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that, in a way, is in that new poem, that's one of the things that I've kind of written about. But my mum did say to me that as an adoptive mother, she felt even more responsible for me and my brother than she would have done had she not, or so she felt. She just felt that she just owed to our birth parents to be able to, if anything ever were to happen, to be able to say, I did my best. And with my brother, you know, he was very different, and so she was always saying our Max is an enigma to me, and she always worried that she hadn't done for him, you know, they hadn't lived the best life. She was obsessed with that as well. You know, I remember saying to my dad one day, well, if you hadn't been adopted by you, you don't know he could have been a serial killer. And my dad went, Christ, I'm supposed to be comforted by that. But there was that kind of way in which you could see very, very clearly with my brother. She always said that it was all to do with biology, and with me, she said it was all to do with nurture. So it was quite interesting.
Another one here, and then there's one there, and then coming up.
Oh gosh, there's lots. Yeah,
thick and fast.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned that you wondered if there was a connection between Alzheimer's and secrecy.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could explain or say a bit more about that.
Okay.
What the idea is there.
Well, one of my friends runs an old people's home in Cornwall, and she noticed that a number of people there had secrets, and a number of them have Alzheimer's. So she first started to wonder about that, and then I started to read about that. And I do think that if your brain is all your life has been keeping something secret, and you've been expending all your energy, that's why my birth mother remembered me after the daughters, because this secret was the one thing she didn't want to ever let go, and she never did tell her daughters or her. They found me separately, actually, through reading that book. So she never did introduce me to her daughters or her husband, and she never got that chance, and they never got that chance to speak. And it was really sad, because her husband actually was is a really lovely man and would have been quite understanding, I think, but she didn't know that, you know.
And also in writing, the subject of what happens to the mind through loss of memory, which is something you write about a lot, because for you as a writer, memory and also secrets and what's hidden inside people are kind of key subjects for you. So, of course, we're talking about human beings and we're talking about, emotional situations, but there's also, as a writer, this is really useful to you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, and that's a kind of strange conundrum.
Yeah.
I think you're fond of these murky areas.
Yeah, I do go for
You
these
do.
murky.
You're fond of them. You've got fun as well. And
Yes. But I'm not being interviewed here, so I can get away with it.
Can you tell me why?
Thank you. I have so many questions I want to ask you because your writing resonates with me, but I'm just going to stick to one, which is the adoption home that I came from. The government still insists that it wasn't an adoption home, even though 6 children in my family were adopted from there. And the redress system doesn't include many people. Is there a similar problem here in the United Kingdom?
Yes, I mean, there is. I mean, there were several children that were sent off from the United Kingdom to Australia against the wishes, actually, of their birth parents. There's lots of children in Ireland, you know, that are kind of famously the Magdalene Laundries babies that there's been films made about and documentaries made about, and the government in Scotland has had to give an apology to birth mothers for forcing birth mothers into giving up their children. My own mother was like that. She was forced into giving up me. It wasn't something that she wanted to do. She was forced into signing these papers, and I feel that's that's horrifying. That there you are, a young woman. You're allowed at the most sort of 10 days to 2 weeks with this baby, and then the baby's taken away from you, and then your whole body is telling you that you've had a baby. You've got milk leaking to your breast, through your shirts. You've got over tender breasts. You've got all of this going on in your body, and if you kept it secret, you've got nobody even to tell it to. So it's massively traumatic. And I think some of those women are coming forward now, and a lot of them have formed groups in this country. When you were talking about the danger of having a big kind of conference like you had in Newcastle, but a lot of people have formed groups and got in touch with each other. Some people actually get very annoyed with me, and they write me letters and notes saying that I put forward far too positive an image of adoption, and it angers them because that's not the experience of an awful lot of people. But all I can say to that is that I can only write from my experience, and actually the experience that you get to hear generally in the culture is negative.
Very interesting. I think we've got time for one more, and then I know that
one up
lots
the back
of
there
people.
as well.
Oh,
Can
there's
we have
one.
that one right up there?
Yeah, we'll take 2. Yes, okay. And then I know there will be people who want to ask questions, but you will have the chance over drinks. So
I was just thinking of the arc of love and loss, actually. And when your mother was saying happiness.
Sorry, I didn't hear your first bit. Sorry.
The arc of love and loss, the relationship between the two, and that when your mother says to you, happiness is another's sorrow, and in some ways that can be a guilt thing, but also it means it opens up something, and it sort of enriches a story. There's always different aspects of a story, but love and loss, I'm just thinking as you speak, you have a Scottish accent, so I was just thinking of that. You're both black, but you are Scottish. And that tradition in Scotland of love and loss and storytelling, and how the ease of that storytelling is part of everyday life, and that your mother, adopted mother, was able to tell you stories of the gash, tell you stories of your childhood, which creates a kind of story of you. And at the funeral of your mother, that story was sort of banished.
Okay, thanks. That's a very interesting about storytelling and Scottish storytelling.
I think that my mum understood that there's a story has an incredible potency, and that the imagination has an importancy, and that if she told us stories back to ourselves, almost like fairy tales or bedtime stories, back to ourselves, that we would have a way of understanding ourselves through story. And so I think that we were made up of stories, and that stories were as important to us as a bowl of porridge. And in fact, there's a line in Red Dust Road which says more or less that we're fed myth and porridge and fable, and that's what made us. And I do think that actually our way of understanding something, whenever we have anything traumatic happens to us, or whenever something creates a ruction, one of the first things that we start to do to ourselves is actually tell it back to ourselves as a story. We'll often we remember the exact time, what the weather was like, what we were wearing, what music was playing, what was on the news, who'd just come to the door, what you were eating. But these are all details of a story that we tell back to ourselves whenever something shocking happens. So we can see that the role of story in all of our lives really is very important. Yes. The role of the imagination to actually be a sanctuary, a safe harbour, someplace to go, somewhere that will house you. And if you look around the world now and you see what's happening with all the different wars, you'll see that in war-torn countries, people are still telling stories, books are still being read, people are still putting plays on, people are still doing poetry readings out of the very rubble, because they know that that is a way of surviving, that literature and survival are kind of intricately linked, and it's not dramatic or over dramatic to make a link between the two.
We have one more question.
Brilliant. This pivots right off of the story question. This is process. You said you wrote the first draft of this chronologically, and then you rewrote it non-chronologically, and I've started a few chapters in, and it's absolutely gorgeous. How long was that? Just simply for you to get to the place where this doesn't work, and you reconciled yourself to that, and then wrote the new draft. And then how much of the old draft made it into the new one, or in what order?
It's a really interesting question. Sometimes I don't know how accurately I can answer that question, because I'd need to go back and read it all to myself and find out which bits came and which bits didn't. But I do know that the guy at the National Library of Scotland that just actually gave a talk on the archive yesterday, apparently. I'd like to be a wee fly in the wall, but anyway, he knows more about me than I know about myself. and he was saying that there's a notebook there. They've got an exhibition box in Edinburgh at the moment, and there's a notebook where I've written about the meeting with Jonathan in this notebook. So I'd obviously written it while I was in Nigeria, which I hadn't actually remembered that I'd done that. And then he double-checked, and he'd gone to Red Dust Road and found that there was a piece in Red Dust Road that was more or less straight from this notebook. So I think I did keep notebooks when I was there, and I did write things into them. And I don't know about tracing how much like Red Dust Road it is. I don't think I looked at it anymore. I think I just started again from scratch, and the whole process, writing the two books back to back, took me 5 years. But I don't think I'm naturally really a prose writer, a long prose writer. So Trumpet also took me 5 years to write. I don't think it comes that easily to me, the actual form. So I just have to struggle on with what wee bits and pieces I've been given.
Struggling. So please, when you make your way, we hope you'll stay and have a drink. And Jackie's very kindly said she'll sign books. So don't all rush off unless you have to. You were talking just then about stories being a kind of safe haven or a sanctuary, and I feel just here in this sort of magic time that we've had with you, that we've all been sort of drawn in to your wonderful storytelling spirit and feel ourselves sort of looked after by it. So thank you so much.
Oh, but can I thank you? I think we've all got to give a huge hand to Hermione, because it was an extraordinary conversation, and she's an extraordinary person. It's been a privilege, it really has. Thank you.
Thank you.